These next couple slides are going to describe muscle fiber or muscle cell properties and the different muscle fiber types. And there's some nice pages out of our textbook starting around page 352 that will also go over these fiber types. So muscle cells or muscle fibers can have different properties, biochemical properties, and that's sort of like the energy system being used. Is it an oxidative energy system, or is it a more glycolytic, meaning fast glycolysis or anaerobic glycolysis, or that immediate energy system? So what is its oxidative capacity? And the other would be type of myosin, ATPase. So how quickly will this muscle contract? If it's a fast contracting fiber, it will need to have a fast form of myosin ATPase. So those are biochemical properties. And as I mentioned, contractile properties. So what would be the speed of contraction? That's the middle bullet point. How much force needs to be generated, and how efficient is that muscle fiber? So those can be thought of as the contractile properties. And our book and other books think of muscle fiber types as being plastic, and that's actually pretty interesting to think about it. That means that following training, these muscle cells or muscle fibers can adapt or can change their properties. And that's pretty interesting and pretty unique. So muscle is plastic, the changing of some muscle fiber properties and how these changes can occur following training. So here's a list that I made up, or a slide I made up, and this is out of our textbook, and they actually made a better table than mine. Their table is table 11.3 on page 354. So I made up my table, and I'll try to describe it. On the left-hand side of this slide are the different kind of fast contracting muscle fiber types. And the fastest contracting is Roman numeral 2, so a type 2 letter B, so type 2B fibers. They're larger in size, they're pretty low resistance to fatigue, so they're going to fatigue quickly. They're very fast contracting, and they would do a lot of anaerobic or fast glycolysis, or a lot of the phosphocreatine energy system. They generate a lot of force, so these are high force fibers. Something relatively new, and it's described in our textbook better than on my slide, are another kind of fast contracting fibers that are called 2X fibers. And they're sort of in the middle of these fast contracting fibers. And they have a slightly different form of myosin, so they're called type 2X fibers. They're still short-term fibers, still anaerobic, still fast contracting, but a little bit more intermediate in terms of their glycolytic versus oxidative capacity. So that's an intermediate type 2X. There's also another fast fiber that's called a 2A fiber. And these 2A fibers are intermediate between type 2 and type 1. Out of the fast fibers, they're the slowest of the fast, if you understand that. And they're nice fibers in that they do both oxidative capacity but also glycolytic capacity. So the current idea, at least, that there are 3 different major fast contracting fiber types: a type 2B, a type 2X, and a type 2A. And on the right-hand side of my figure, or my slide, are the one muscle fiber type that's considered slow. So it's the Roman numeral 1, so type 1 fiber. It is slow twitch, and it's slow contracting, yet it's very oxidative, meaning it would do a lot of the aerobic energy system. And on the bottom of page 352, there's another little table that describes some abbreviations for these fibers. So type 1 fibers are considered slow oxidative, so SO fibers. These type 2A are fast oxidative glycolytic, or FOG, F-O-G. And these type 2B fibers, the fastest, are FG fibers, or fast glycolytic. I tried to put this into my own sort of table, and here are the different fiber types. So on the right-hand side are the slowest contracting type 1 fibers, and then there are 1, 2, 3 of these different type 2 fibers. A type 2A, and then way over on the left, the fastest contracting type 2B, and sort of in the middle of these type 2 fibers would be the type 2X. And sort of think about, what these fibers are going to be doing. If they need to contract quickly, they would have a highest form of ATPase. If they're contracting quickly, they would have a high Vmax, a speed of shortening, and they would be doing a lot of anaerobic, either fast glycolytic or that ATPPC energy system. On the opposite side of this spectrum of muscle fiber types would be the slowest contracting type 1 fibers. So their speed of shortening would be low, their ATPase activity would be very low, relatively low, yet they're doing a lot of the aerobic energy system. So when I type this up as a table, but you can sort of think about what these fibers need to be doing and then what would be the characteristics of these different muscle fiber types. On page 352, they show a picture of histochemical staining, and also they describe this in more detail in figure 1125, which is on page 355. And I'll just sort of quickly describe it here. So how are these muscle fiber types determined? One way is through histochemical staining. And I've done this before, and actually I think we can do this in our exercise physiology lab. So histochemical staining, and I think I have a picture of it coming up next, is simply taking a muscle sample, and in our book they have a nice picture of the needle that is used to jab, poke into someone to get a little sample of muscle. And this muscle sample is sliced and then it is stained with different kind of chemicals. And based on the pH, so based on the acid base of the staining, the different muscle cells, so each one of these is a different muscle cell. This is not a real high magnification. So there's actually 3 different stains here. One that didn't stain at all, so it's white, and then a sort of intermediate stain and a black one. And so based on what chemical and what pH was put on this sample of a muscle fiber, it will stain with different darknesses, and you can simply count how many of the darker, at least in this case, are the type 1 fibers, and then the intermediates that didn't stain at all, and the fast contracting that stained this way. So you can just simply count. Another way to look at muscle fiber types, and now a more accurate way, is called SDS gel electrophoresis. And we also can do this in our exercise physiology lab. We would need to take a muscle sample, and then it is simply ground up in some different chemicals, and a pipette is used to squirt or load this muscle sample on this piece of gel. So this portion of this device is simply a piece of gel. It's almost like Jell-O. And it's electrophoresis. So there's a different electrical charge on the bottom and on the top, and then this device is turned on. And so as electricity is going through this piece of gel, it's going to pull down the proteins that are now in the wells in the top of this piece of gel. And they're going to migrate, they're going to move down on this gel based on their size and based on their charge. And so then you just turn this device off after hours maybe, and you'll stain it, typically a blue stain. And then you take off the gel and we'll sort of look at it or dry it. And so on the right-hand side is just a version of this gel that has been stained blue. And so all these bands represent different proteins. So if you had a myosin protein that was a myosin protein that was a little bit heavier, that was characteristic of, let's say, fast muscle fibers, it maybe would not migrate as far on this piece of gel. So it's a more accurate way to differentiate between the muscle fiber types. Actually, you can use this SDS gel electrophoresis now with genes, so with DNA and RNA. So the different ways to look at muscle fiber types, and as you would predict, power athletes, so either sprinters or power lifters, they would have high amount of the fast muscle fiber types. They need to generate force relatively quickly. So they would have a high percentage of the type 2, classify them all together, and probably even more of the type 2B or 2X fibers. Endurance athletes on the opposite side of this spectrum of muscle fiber types, endurance athletes like marathon runners or Tour de France bike riders would have a high percentage of the slow fibers, a high percentage of type 1 fibers. And if you're just lifting weights, or if you're a more sedentary person, it sort of depends, but it's probably around 50-50. So 50-50 type 1, or 50% type 1, 50% type 2. So as I mentioned, muscle fibers are plastic, so they can adapt or they can change. And it looks like with endurance and resistance training, we can shift within the type 2 fibers. So with endurance and resistance training, we can go from a type 2B to a 2X to a 2A. So we can change within the type 2 fibers. As of yet, there's not really good research to show that we can make the jump from fast to slow. So we can't go from type 2 to type 1. There's some evidence maybe it can be done, not really good evidence. So I sort of look at it as a continuum of muscle fiber types. And with endurance training, at least, the way I've drawn this arrow is we can go from the fastest contracting to maybe some more of these intermediate fibers, or maybe in the middle here, more 2X fibers. But so far it looks like we can't go all the way from type 1 fibers. So, Olympic class marathon runners, they were born, genetically, they were born with a lot of type 1 fibers. And then through training, the other fiber types that they have are a lot of these intermediate, probably type 2A, maybe 2X fiber types. And this is copied this from another textbook, but it just shows that we don't change the fiber number. With training, we change the characteristics of those fiber types. So notice that there was a decrease in the type 2B, the fast contracting fibers, by 13%, and an increase in 2A, those intermediate fibers, by 13%. So it's the same percent change of fiber types, so they just simply change their characteristics. They didn't change the number. We're probably born, or soon after birth, we're born with a certain number of muscle fibers. We can change the characteristics. We can't really change the muscle fiber types. So to finish off, we remember the muscle sliding filament theory of muscle contraction, and myosin is really unique, and the myosin head is really unique. We just talked about ATPase activity, right? So fast contracting muscle fibers would have a fast or high ATPase activity. So there's a lot happening with the myosin head. It has ATPase activity, it acts as an enzyme. It also will bind ATP, and it also needs to bind actin. So a lot is happening at that head of myosin. And here's this picture out of our textbook. It has to bind ATP, it has to bind actin, and it has to break down ATP. So it has to have ATPase activity. Here's another picture from our textbook. So here's the ATP molecule, and there's the actin molecule, and it needs to break up that ATP as well. So really interesting things happening with muscle fiber types, their characteristics, and how they can change or adapt with training.